my life like a son of a gun.
Okay, hi, we are back. This is Ashley this is Poe Literotica here, and we are going to be doing political erotica things. This is an older video that I had planned actually a really, really long time ago, but never actually got around to creating. So as you can see, there is a little bit of a template here. There is the talking points that we're going to be going over today, and I'll quickly explain what they are. So we're going to be talking about the complex, actually not so complex, not so double-sided topic of slavery in the USA and a lot of people's normal perceptions of what the goings-on of slavery was like. And this was prompted based on a question from a follower of mine that has been a follower for a long time, and they asked a question that was innocent enough that warranted a whole research topic. But this was at the time of me creating the Candace Owens video, and I just felt like this didn't have a place in that series, but I finally figured out that it can just be its own video. It doesn't have to fit into a greater narrative. I just feel like it's something that needs to be addressed, is just average American and Canadian view on slavery as being all too positive, which is very reductionist, and we're going to be debunking that today. The person had a bunch of talking points, as you can see here, that we're going to debunk. I don't really like the framing of this question because I find it very misinformed. It just comes from a very disingenuous place. But honestly, I don't think that the person who sent this question and is asking these things that are clearly worded in ways that I would not personally word any question is at least coming from some sort of positivity. At least it's not a crazy person who is messaging us telling us that we're wrong for caring about each other. So without further ado, I'm going to be reading this script that I wrote a little while ago. So, slavery in the USA. Let's begin. So, your question, or the question of the person asking this whole video is going to be framed as if I'm talking directly to the asker. So, your question struck a particular chord, and I encourage you to take time to read my entire passage or watch this entire video. And excuse my spelling errors, I'm only human, and I wrote all of this on my iPad, as you'll be seeing as we go through these slides. So here is the first point that the person brings up. They say, "I don't think it's a troll here. Here's the problem. You take a concept that is outdated by time. At the time, having slaves wasn't out of the ordinary, and that's true. It's like owning a pet." They go on. "Today, it's okay, but 50 years ago, we might say, wow, that's so wrong. Are you a bad person today if you own a pet? I get that there are humans, these are humans that we are talking about, but the perspective needs to come from some time." Then this person says, "Correct. Today, it is bad if you have slaves." And that's how they end this paragraph. I feel like I need to copy and paste this like all in one sentence because it's really, really hard for me to read it separately. So, one moment. I'm going to modify this really quick, because it's really hard for you guys to get the full context of what this person said to me if I read it in fragments. So I'm going to explain. This weird troll page had been following the Politerotica around for a little while now, and I personally don't believe that the person who is messaging me and commenting on a lot of these pages is a honest actor. Honestly, I believe that they're just a disingenuous troll who doesn't believe any of the things that they're saying and are purposefully seeking out places like my page that harbor kind of a socialistic ideology that they are so quick to disagree with. Of course, I also noticed their comments under every single other page that I follow. And doing that research just a little bit of research made me realize, oh, well, this person is not real. They don't exist. There's not an imprint of them that exists online. So I am under an assumption that the person that created the Politerotica is a bitch page is a complete and utter troll that doesn't actually exist, if you know what I mean. Like, that person behind that page doesn't actually exist. So in the wake of that person messaging me and doing things and baiting me into conversations, I realized that in doing this and in participating in conversations with these people, and instead of having a conversation with the people that are asking the questions, like the person that we're addressing in today's video, we're completely just ripping apart our own cause, because those people are just going to use those conversations and those negative interactions with us, the left, as more cannon fodder for them to be disingenuous in the future. So what I'm trying to do here in this video is, instead of combat that individual troll, let's just talk about the misinformation that they were spreading, and then in turn were accidentally spreading it to my followers by me sharing their ideas. So yes, if you're wondering, owning slaves, even back in the day when it was acceptable, quote unquote, was still objectively wrong. We're going to talk about that today. So here is the complete passage of what this person wrote to me. And we're going to read it, and then I'm going to debunk it piece by piece. So it says, I don't think that this is a troll here, in reference to the literal troll that we've discussed on this page before. Here is the problem. You take a concept that is outdated by time. At the time, having slaves wasn't out of the ordinary, and that is true. It's like owning a pet. Today, it's okay, but 50 years from now, we might say, oh wow, that is so wrong. Are you a bad person today for owning a pet? Correct. Today, it's bad if you have slaves. End of quote. So, okay. Here we are. Outdated by time. Sure. Interesting phrasing. Fair. It's fair that this is a surface assumption of the general consensus of slavery through the ages. People did it. Regular people enabled it. Then we recognized as a collective society and as a human species that it was wrong, and that we did everything that we could to remove it, aside from, modern slavery and all that jazz. This first sentence completely misses the point of the copious other inflammatory statements coming from this person, the person that this, oh, they're not actually a troll, is coming from. This particular page doesn't say, okay, so this troll page doesn't actually just run around saying run-of-the-mill statements like, oh, baby Hitler did nothing wrong. It's more like targeting mourning people of color activists and posting statements about how they should have acted and how their actions were more warranted towards murder, calling to arms, etc. A lot of language that nowadays, after a wake of a lot of the violence that we've been seeing and a lot of the racist groups that we've been seeing, it just echoes that phrasing. So when you're trying to defend this person, well, I don't think it's a troll. This is definitely a troll, and at least in this instance. And if it's not, and then you're still kind of going on in this sentence saying that, like, maybe they're not the bad actor here, that's the wrong side of this argument, Mr. Follower person, and I would encourage you not to be on that side of the argument. So, there's a lot of talk about how someone should have acted or what their actions shouldn't have warranted murder. They go on pages of people that are specifically, it's violence against women, or specifically pages where it's people of color mourning the deaths of the various men and women that have fallen to police brutality and white supremacy. It's very disingenuous. It's so, I hate using that word over and over again. It's just so fake and hollow and gross. You see these comments under these pages where this guy is just being racist. I don't know how else to describe it. He's going to these pages that are particularly vulnerable, that are mourning, rightfully so, and he's just creating statements that are mean and making people have conversations that they shouldn't have in places that they shouldn't have. Places that should be safe spaces and far, far away from dealing with white supremacist troll pages. Yet, here they are. And yet, here you are, Mr. Commenter, that decided to, for some reason, defend what this person had to say. So, questioning my defense of the countless people affected by this practice, the practice of white supremacy, police brutality, slavery, while you defend the families that may have to tell themselves before they go to bed every night that they did nothing wrong, instead of worrying about, if you will wake up tomorrow or get through the day tomorrow. It's just very weird that we're worrying more about the ancestors of the people that perpetuated this violence than the actual people that are still, to this day, dealing with the problems that stemmed from the practice of keeping and enslaving each other as property, as the means of creating the US economy. It's very disgusting. And at the time, they, of course, maybe at the time, it wasn't out of the ordinary. That's true, he says. He says, in the Mr. Commenter, it was like owning a pet. Okay. That's not true. We've always known humans are different from animals. We've always known that, both biologically and spiritually. I do not subscribe to religion, but I can't omit its presence in how society has viewed humanity and what it means to be human in many respects. We are man, not beast or cattle or, we have been diminished to cattle or beast and have had this done by human perception, not by nature or virtue. So we like to believe that we're not these things. We are not property. We are not beast, any of these things. We know these things as core human values. Part of the reason why a lot of people want to believe in religion, want to separate themselves as humans from the beast. But at the same time, we're kind of fighting this. We're being diminished to cattle and beasts and all these things by other humans. It's not by nature or virtue. It's not because we're just meant to be treated that way. It's because there are systems that are enacted by mankind to treat each other this way. And it might have been shitty at the time to do so, and it's shitty now. No, it wasn't like owning a pet or like cattle or having a beast. It was deliberately owning and encaging and keeping a human for the purpose of labor and services. We well documented that each other are people, and it's hard to disassociate with each other as humans. It takes a lot of propaganda, it takes a lot of manipulation in order to get a society to a place where they are okay, even as a general consensus, to treat each other in such a way, even as pets, as this person is so kind to say. Mankind has only been able to inflict the idea that it is okay on a systemic level to diminish all semblance of humanity and serve someone or something as long as they have the power to do so. Let's imagine that world for just a moment. That crazy, scary world. Horses, dogs, and enslaved people from Africa. Not to mention the figure 1 attached, the picture that you saw at the very beginning. That illustrates that many societies have kind of forgotten what slavery looked like. I'll scroll up. This is what it looked like. This is what the creation of the new world looked like. It was disgusting, pathetic, and manipulative. And I will not sit here and be gaslit into reducing America's coming to be, or even just North America's coming to be, as anything more than this photo of toting bodies wall to wall across the sea in hopes that you can get them for free labor instead of just doing it yourselves. I'm sorry, I don't agree with that. I don't like it. And everyone and every single person who participated in that cycle, even back then when it was okay and accepted, are still bad people to this day, and I don't like them. Okay? Sorry. Same way we don't like people that participate in, child labor. Of course, we have things that might be accumulated from those resources. But if any individual like had the choice, they'd be like, I'm gonna opt out for that. Same with like factory farming. If we as an individual chose to end the suffering of another person or another being, I'm going to be inclined to say that the objective right decision would be to not do it. I mean, to not inflict suffering on people or things or beings. It just makes obvious sense not to do that. So in a world, in a society where a lot of people had the choice to own another human being through monetary gain or having the means to do so, they had the choice, and they made that choice, and that's a bad choice. And we're going to hold them accountable for making that choice for the rest of their miserable lives and their miserable family lives. That's still, okay, so our society still utilizes slavery to form the society we have today because we benefit from the same free-form labor complex that the United States was founded upon, farming and using cheap labor to create goods and services, supply and demand, etc., etc. We're not going to go into how complicated economics is in America, but it all comes from how easy it was for them to just capture people and just make them do the work for them instead of maybe pulling up their bootstraps and getting it done themselves. Sure, things would be different, but I'm sure that under any circumstances, I would argue the latter would be optimal. We'd definitely prefer that not to have happened. So, the society we have today that still uses a set of minimum wage-based labor to exploit low-income people and low education people, it's an entirely different argument to be having whether or not we should uphold that current system or whether or not we should fight against it. But we're not having an argument whether or not that system has an impact on current society. It's a fact. This is what America came from, and this is the side effects. And the fact that this person, who seemingly seems to be a nice person, is asking these kinds of questions and forming the question in such a misinformed way is scary, especially considering somebody who's probably on the left, much like the rest of us. So in this world that your statement creates, you say that at the time, let's just assume we're talking about the time that this person is referencing, not now or anything, some weird objective world. I feel like I'm just saying nothing words now. Slavery has always been wrong. If you don't want to believe me, then I'm sure if you want to read some testimony from slaves in Jerusalem or Egypt or maybe in the Americas, they'll tell you that being free is kind of all they talked about and all they sang about and all they wrote about. Being free was all they lived to want. So, no, I'd argue they weren't happy. No, not in any sense of the word. Being free is the optimal choice. If you're given a choice, probably freedom. So, in America, the actual historical reason the majority of working class or poor whites didn't see it as wrong to enslave black people was back then, it was commonly normal. They were constantly bombarded with rhetoric calling down African Americans, instilling the idea that African Americans were made to be slaves and that their ways were barbaric and need to be tamed in some way, that they needed to become man from beast. They had this constant droning of this propaganda into their heads. And of course, back then a lot of people couldn't really read or write, and they didn't have the free market of ideas that we'd have today, where they could just pick up and choose what they watched. It was just, this is what the paper has to say today, and so everyone in the town is going to believe it. The slave traders of the Atlantic slave trade knew the vast majority of whites would not take well to an integration of enslaved people without fear of being liberated by said whites. So the people who were bringing, sorry, let me adjust my microphone, people that were bringing these slaves over here were horrified, or enslaved people, human beings, were horrified at the prospect that the people that we were bringing them to, the Americans, the poor Americans, would see them as equal and free them. So in order to combat that, the colonists feared that so much that they would, maybe sympathize with the new American slave population and allow uprisings. Uprisings that led inevitably to the end of slavery and many other colonies at the time throughout history, even before the Americans. That sympathy and that solidarity with people from anything totally kills slavery. It kills the idea that there was some sort of manifest destiny that Americans deserved this, and that the African were reduced to some sort of animalistic desire. It's absolutely bullhonky, and they knew it was bullhonky. They knew Americans, new Americans, especially ones that just came from the tyranny of the British rule, were not going to be hot on the idea of enslaving each other. So racism had to come into play, and it had to come into play very hardcore. So much so that people like this that are asking me these kinds of questions have it in their head that this was some sort of system that was genuinely, like, we consented to, that people were okay with. When that's not the case. If you look at writings from people that didn't own slaves, or people that weren't outwardly racist at the time, which was actually quite popular, upsettingly so that just shows that the people in power at the time had such a stranglehold on the narrative and stranglehold on the means of distribution that they were able to do this. It's like, I need a drink of water. So the idea that these new Americans were left with during slavery was that Africans were genetically inferior, and other, currently scientifically debunked statements that imply that Africans were suited for work on the fields, or not taking into the account that agriculture in Africa varied from region to region, and skills that they saw Africans having and maybe harvesting cocoa and community tribes from the spirits, maybe that weird shit that they were so obsessed with recreating and suppressing at the same time. So it makes me so angry that they saw these things as valuable, as the traditions that these amazing Africans had back in the day before colonial rule had. They saw these as valuable skills, and they wanted to bring them over to the America in some way. But they were so worried about how the people in America would not take so well to, them toting them over in such big scary boats and whipping them and treating them like animals. They had to combine that with, they're actually scary, barbaric people. So there was a very, very, very brief time in postmodern Americana, I think they call it. Don't quote me, I'm not Jordan Peterson, I'm not fucking genius on white people. But there was a very brief time where America was very, very obsessed with the traditions and modern aspects of what at the time was modern Africa. And the colonialists and the racists were super, super unhappy about it. There's so much writing that was suppressed at the time about people's interest in the different hairstyles that the Africans had, and the different traditions that were being told, and stories that were being told, that by the time that slavery and the Atlantic slave trade had kind of taken its full stranglehold over America, people had completely kind of forgotten about that weird intrigue that they had over these customs. And to them, they were weird customs, but to the people that were doing them, that was just their way of life. And to us, we even have this sick idea that those customs are still weird and they are still barbaric, but they're not. They're just how different humans act, and some humans don't wear shoes, and that's fucking okay. All right, just get over it, Mr. Colonial guy. It makes me angry that I have to explain these things to people, because I feel like, not to brag, I always valued humans as equal, and never really saw different cultures as on a value scale of what they've contributed to the overall arcing of society. But that's what the scary Ben Shapiro crowd feel that all cultures have to live towards. Like, you have to have contributed something to have had value as a culture. So if we're going to be going by that definition, then I guess maybe we should start treating black people with the proper respect and solidarity that they should be granted with in America, considering that the entire reason why America functions the way it is and the way that they're so proud of the right is, we're not proud of it, we don't like it, we want to change it, but they're proud of it and they want to keep it that way and make it great, etc. This is what they want to uphold, oh, so badly. So if that's what they want to be proud of, then okay, all right, thanks for making it obvious that you guys are scumbags, and you're dragging down perfectly normal, free-thinking people that ask these questions with you, and I'm not gonna have it. That's why we're making this video today. So they saw the value that these community tribes had, but they split their connection with their homelands to make them docile and more easy to control. This is something that they did also to the Native Americans as well, and Native Canadians. It's a classic strategy for suppressing a culture. Your statement, or at least the statement of the commenter, the one we're rebutting, implies that the general consensus of white Americans who both owned slaves but also witnessed it had no contention to what was going on, and saw it as something as normally as owning a pet, which they did not. They lived in a society where people of color were not people. So, do you know how much propaganda that had to be created in order to keep a lower class white population from seeking solidarity with enslaved Africans? Do you understand the statement that this question even makes? This is not me trying to be rude or me trying to be combative. This is a legitimate concern of mine that maybe your schooling system may not have emphasized how important it is to relearn these things as adults and to go back and re-understand the fundamentals of, the enslavement of African Americans and how that created America, how that impacts their society to this day, how it impacts our society, how we talk about these things, how we ask questions. So if we're not going to go back and relearn these things and just expect people on YouTube and people on Instagram to answer these questions and to have all of the answers just readily available for you without you even just taking the time to go back and relearn it yourself. Because if you went back and relearned all of this stuff yourself, or even just watched one documentary on slavery at the time, you'd realize how silly this statement was and how poorly worded it was, how just bad of a statement it is, and why I needed to spend at least 30 minutes talking about it. So, okay, here we are. There are a lot of things that upset me about this passage, but to compare these two concepts, like the concept of slavery and having a pet, leaving out the gaping hole that is white supremacy, and that at the time white supremacy was like the only way of living, is super daunting. Those who fought against slavery and white politicians and early civil rights activists before the Emancipation Proclamation and all that fun Abraham Lincoln American jazz, they were either lynched if they were black or not able to vote if they were women, and completely disenfranchised if they had any instance of power if they decided to vocalize these things. And if they were successful white cisgendered men, they had their businesses burned down as well. Even better, straight up erased from history. You won't even get to find a lot of the information of the people that were vocal against slavery and against states' rights and all of these things, because they were erased from the history books, my friends. There were plenty of slave rebellions assisted by white Americans at this time who recognized what was going on around them and recognized what was going on was wrong. and they were called, oh, good slave owners. And they go down in history as something that gets echoed into the modern perception of slavery as something that was the norm. When no, that wasn't the norm. That was the equivalent of a social justice warrior back then. Those people were chastised, ostracized, killed, burned, maimed, you name it. And those people were scrubbed from history. That's why they're not in your textbooks, my friend. That's why you have to go back and relearn these things and not just depend on what you learned in History 12. Okay. So society and history likes to remember those people, the activists and the people that were fighting on the front lines for the freedom of Americans as good slave owners. They did what they could in a society that acted violently towards them, and if they didn't comply, they would die. So they kind of had to live within the society in the confines of it, and it was depressing and not something we want to remember fondly. Or something that was positive, because those people also participated in a system that were shitty. But mind you, those people were not the norm. If they were the norm, I'm not sure, like, if they were the norm, why would, okay, Jesus Christ. But you know, having these kinds of conversations just makes me want to rub my forehead and have a nice bath, because they're Canadians. These are Canadians that are asking me these questions. Do you even understand what this statement means, Mr. Question Asker? The U.S. and in part, the Atlantic slave trade was highly contested politically and socially, and this is well documented if you watch any Civil War documentary or even low bar ones like the History Channel, if you just go back and take a few minutes to relearn something. Slavery was fought against during its inception and had to be sold on the American pioneer types who left England in fear of the same sort of desperate oppression. So these very, very, very desperate racist means, these means that we still are seeing affected in our daily lives to this day. The kinds of stereotyping, the kinds of rhetoric that you still hear echoed, the kinds of rhetoric and the kinds of stereotyping that still to this day gets people killed, still to this day gets people discriminated against in stores. And where does that all come from? The slavery and the idea that the government and that many, many corporations and that business owners at the time banded together in order to sell the idea that the African man or the African American man was somehow lesser and deserving of slavery, so people would buy it. Otherwise, people wouldn't have bought it. People would have been like, no, that's bad. I don't want to do that. But people were racist at the time, and they need to be held accountable for that racism. We can't just say, oh, it was like that at the time. It's just the way it is. No, that's not the way it is. It's not the way it was in Canada. That's not the way it was in plenty of other countries that didn't do specifically the acts that contributed to the Atlantic slave trade. I'm sure Canada, yes, has done a lot of shitty things, especially in the way that we had our Trans-Canada Trail and our Trans-Canada Railway, is that what it's called? It was completely built by Chinese slave labor that to this day we're still seeing economic manifestations of racism towards, but nowhere near to the systematic and disgusting effects that American slavery has had on the entire world, mind you. And then their attitude against it to rub their our freaking nose in it every 4 years and reminding us that they still have the power and that they aren't going to give it back. They're not going to apologize, and none of their grandchildren are going to be held responsible for any of this because, oh, it was just normal at the time. That's just the way it is. No, that's not the way it is. If it was the way it is, they wouldn't have killed every single person that opposed it. Thank you very much. So, we're still seeing the same exact effects to this day. For example, it's an old slave stereotype that black people are less intelligent for speaking in a traditionally black accent you might still hear on TV. This is actually a recognized form of speech that was suppressed in schools to assimilate Black African Americans into Western culture. This is a dialect that comes from a more mature, traditional Southern accent, or English, phonetics, and mixed with the natural accent that comes from African regions. So when you hear Black speak or a Blaccent, this is still actively suppressed in schools, it's suppressed in pop culture, it's seen as something as less intelligent, when in reality it gets to the same phonetic points, you understand the same concepts, and they're actually able to talk with less words, which in other languages is actually seen as more optimal as opposed to seeing as something more negative. In English, it's seen as more intelligent to use more words to describe something. In many other languages, that's not true. It's seen as optimal and more efficient to reduce language barriers and just start speaking in ways that you can convey any sort of language. And in many ways, that is suppressed. So that's white supremacy. It's suppressed because it's something that is inherently Black and they don't like it. And so I encourage all of you youth people that have been told to speak properly or to speak articulately, tell them to go suck it, because you do speak articulately. You speak naturally and you speak phonetically. So do not let anybody tell you that you are wrong. That is a natural way of speaking, and don't suppress it. Remember when Obama said axe instead of ask, and the media blew up? Like, it was such a simpler time back then when the news would actually cover things that were silly, but there was constantly, oh, Obama did this, or oh, Obama did that. Sure, he had a funky pronunciation of some words, but that funky pronunciation was just a traditionally like Southern way, a Hawaiian way. It's just a way that in which Americans speak that varies from region to region. Some Americans say crick, some say creek, some Canadians say aboot, and some say about. It's not all about your psychological relation with the words and being super intelligent. Sometimes your tongue and the way that you think about language has an impact on how it comes out. So sometimes you're going to speak in ways that come out a little bit differently. Every once in a while, if you get me around the right people, I'll start having a more like native accent. And that isn't because I'm consciously being like, oh, like talk native, be stoic. It's just something that comes out in the way that we speak. So to actively suppress the way that Black people speak makes me a little bit frustrated, because I've never once met somebody from Africa who is speaking English who has any problems speaking. It's just the way that the language, you hear it in your ears, it has a pop culture connotation. You hear it and you think, hey, yeah, that kind of sounds like Black Panther. And you shouldn't reduce it to less intelligent. That's just how the accent sounds. When I hear someone from England, or when I hear someone from Australia, or someone from Taiwan, or even like, what another thing is that people with a Chinese accent also get reduced to being less intelligent because of the way that their language sounds. That's just the natural way the accent sounds, and there's nothing you can do to change that. And it's not okay to reduce the way an accent sounds to how intelligent somebody is. That is one of the oldest perpetuated stereotypes that slavery has, and it's so, I see it every day in comment sections whenever I'm watching like TYT, and then there's like a Black host on, and the comment section from those racist people are saying, oh, like, can't you pronounce anything properly, or blah, blah, blah. It just makes me sick, because I argue there's a lot of Southern people out there that are speaking so improperly, it makes me frustrated. So, okay, phonetics aside, don't let anyone suppress the way that you speak. The majority, I guess majority leaders, politicians, and yeah, Democrats, if you didn't know, the parties are actually had a different alignment back in the days of yore, or the before Civil War. So back then, the Republican Party fought, I guess, Party of Lincoln, fought to abolish slavery, oddly enough. At the time, as they say, the Southern Democrats wanted to keep slavery as an economic means to grow and expand the U.S., while the old Lincoln Republicans fought to abolish slavery and trying to undo the racist propaganda that fed the U.S. population at that time. That caused them to, excuse slavery in the first place, that horrible propaganda. So there's like the Southern Democrats, which at the time were the bad guys, and the Northern Republicans were the good guys. I know that you may not have read this all before, maybe, but it's kind of complicated to talk about. Okay. It's kind of complicated to talk about the party switch, but at the same time, it's not. Party switch is as simple as the Southern Democrats are modern day Republicans. So many of the Republican base will find it upon themselves to, for some reason, deny this as if it has some sort of it's going to favor them in some way. Like, no, we were actually the Republicans back then, and you guys were the bad guys. But if the party switch never happened and you guys were always the good guys, that to this day, what does that make you? That still makes you the guys that are okay with what's going on now. They want to deny the party switch as if that's going to favor to them, but that just anyone who denies the party switch just fundamentally doesn't understand the dynamics of government and that parties can switch. It's totally normal and happens all the time. If they just think that's going to serve their narrative in their favor, that's just sad. Many, in fact, a lot of people, including Lincoln, said that racism that the U.S. had was a strategy that even he adopted in his earlier campaigns to get the Southern vote. It was something that was popular at the time, and it was trendy, much like kind of it is now. And it's very disgusting to think about that we're repeating the same mistakes as Democrats and as Republicans. This is why you find a lot of articles calling Lincoln maybe a racist at the time, because at the time, as you say, it was trendy to be racist. It was trendy or cool to have slaves. Well, it wasn't trendy or cool. It was shoved down their throat by propaganda that that's the life that they had to live in order to prosper and to be all these things. So, Abraham Lincoln, being ever the savvy politician, wanted power. So he played the political system in order to gain the power and leverage that he needed. In modern day, I don't think he would have ran as a Republican, but that was the party that had the belief system and the votes to get the power he needed to get there. So that's the party he ran on. And that's where we are. Politics was a lot less strict back then. It was just like, hey, you Republican, you Democrat, do you want slavery or not? Don't let them reduce it to these complicated, it was actually this or that. No, the Civil War was literally reduced to a battle of, do you want slavery or do you not want slavery? And they didn't want it. America didn't want it, but the South did, and the South is bad, and we don't like them. People, much like being racist today, had to hide their relations to black people and interracial couples, particularly white women with black women faced copious amounts of violence. Where does that violence and that hate come from? It doesn't just, people aren't just naturally inclined to enslave each other. In fact, history points to the fact that we're more likely to free each other from slavery than to perpetuate it systematically. Not every human lived and breathed slavery at this time, and many lived their lives completely unaffected by it, and only really eyeing the benefits from afar. This led to a well-documented perception of white working-class Americans that slavery was not actually that big of a deal. In fact, it was a super big deal for the people who were enslaved. But you don't really hear much about their stories because their stories weren't written down, now were they? They're not printed in your textbooks and they're not in the documentaries because they didn't matter. They were property, they were cattle, they were beasts, they didn't matter. So why would we have a good like, of course it makes sense. Like, oh yeah, everything was just fine and peachy clean back then. It's just the way it is. I'm sure they had some grievances. I'm sure they did. Because you wouldn't ask a horse about his experience on the farm, would you? So you're not, these people aren't going to ask the commodities that they've enslaved about their experience and write them down and put that in the history books, now are they? Because they were racist, horrible people that were bred to be this way. They were, okay, so enslaved Americans at the time were essentially animals. Animals that had to be taught to be dehumanized. And other humans had to be taught to dehumanize these people. So to speak, we had to dehumanize each other. We had to make them speak different languages. We had to... Okay, so let's think about it this way. I want to reframe what I was just saying. So these slaves, human beings, were essentially reduced to animals. We had to teach these animals that we had turned from humans into animals to speak our own language so they could fully understand us when we called them animals and cattle. We told them and taught them to speak English just to have them be able to understand us. Sorry, I want to reframe this sentence again because it's very powerful and I want it to be proper. So, okay, these people, these human beings, African American slaves, were essentially animals. Animals that had to be taught to be dehumanized as animals. We, as the scary white supremacist America, not we, but you know what I mean, like America, the one that we live in, the one with the flag and the same damn flag that they're flying to this day. So, the perpetuators of the Atlantic slave trade taught these people that they reduced to animals to be able to speak their own language just to have them be able to understand them when they are begging them to stop, begging to be free, bringing them home, asking them what's happening. So in a world where you weren't happy with just assimilating them and making them become animals, reducing them to cattle to work for you on your farms, they had the audacity to teach them English and to teach them about God and to teach them about morals and ethics and everything that the human mind would be able to articulate naturally without prompt. So these disgusting creatures that perpetuated the American slave trade felt it part of their job to teach the people that they were enslaving and to fully understand what they were doing to them, and then to turn around and say, oh, it wasn't actually that bad because they say they're happy, while killing everybody who said they weren't happy. God, it's okay. So slavery was not To Kill a Mockingbird or an Aunt Jemima. It's mothers drowning their own babies in the river hoping that their babies will make it to heaven before they have to even grow up into this world. It's men breaking free and jumping ship before they even got to America. The Underground Railroad to freedom to our country, the country of Canada, the thing that we're so goddamn proud of. Where do you think that all came from? That wasn't something that was encouraged by the U.S. government. It was something that was actively suppressed. It was something that we had to fight for. The suppression of humanity and the psychological manipulation it takes to get a society like America, like the Freedom People, like all those Republicans, to comply and to condone slavery, since it had been oh so quote-unquote popular in human history. Luckily, there's a lot of documentaries about it, and we know now that they weren't happy. They were never happy. No one complied. The people that were witnessing this happen were fully aware that there was an atrocity, and the people participating in it are shitty people, and they should be remembered as shitty people. No one should reduce this to, oh, but it was actually just the time. It was not just the time. This was something that they reduced human beings from man to beast, taught them our language, just so they could fully understand what was going on. And that's disgusting. Abolishing slavery and its effects is a huge deal, and it was not a fringe movement or even unpopular. It was actively suppressed, my friend. It is sad that you don't even know or even care enough to learn about it. But you definitely cared enough to defend the practice of those or many who may have been good in your eyes. Good enough to keep humans like pets, as you say. Economic and racial, religious slavery has always been wrong and opposed by local to federal government in the US, worldwide, since humankind. Because anybody who is kept under any human who is kept under any sort of oppression will always long to be free. That's just the way it works. I mean, if you study basic psychology or even basic philosophy, that is the one thing mankind wants more, is to be free. Some of us want to be free from ourselves, some of us want to be free from cages, oppression, but you put a man in a cage and the only thing that he'll think about for the rest of his life is what it's like on the other side of those bars. Rich, poor, etc., white people. It was always been wrong to enslave each other. And it was always, and always has been, a fight versus good versus bad people. Not a fight against the natural order of things and just the way things go and the way history is. Every nation that used slavery has overcome it by a means of force or by gradual social change facilitated by the opposition, not by time and time alone. It's something that needed to be forced to be changed because it needed to be forced to be perpetuated in the first place. They were working against human nature to suppress us, and now we have to work against their suppression to get back to the way that humans continue to live, which I personally believe is free and happily. The forces keeping it in place were inherently bad. All forces keeping slavery in place were bad. The slave owners that beat, overworked, underfed, and kept people were bad. The people around watching this happening were bad. And I am sure that you've created some sort of utopian ideas in somewhere created in your mind where some treated each other like pets or like equals. And that's still not a high bar. I'm sorry. They stole these people from their homeland, bred them like cattle, and sold them to people who did not want to farm their own farms. And even in the best case scenario, it was just pure exploitation. And I will argue with confidence that any human being alive on this planet, dead or alive, was a bad person for perpetuating in the enslavement of another human race, creed, religion, at all. I will fight you on that point. Any single human being that participates in that system, dead or alive, is a bad person. You cannot, under any circumstances, reduce that to, oh, but it was just the time. It was not just the time. If it was just the time, then maybe why would, up north, Canada be looking down with their noses up, being like, what the heck are you doing down there? Explaining that seems like I'm talking to a crazy person. Those who kept and contributed to this style of living in any respect, something that could only be achieved if you believed in the inferiority of man anyway, means that you were a bad person. And they knew it was wrong. I don't care if the elite class of people who orchestrated the Atlantic slave trade didn't consider it wrong. And if you read the history books in your grade 12 midterm, some of those people for sure had a lot of sentimental features inside of those passages in your textbooks. But I'm also pretty sure, I'm 100% sure, the people who were enslaved did definitely think it was wrong the whole time. Probably from day one. There was never a point in their mind where they were like, is manifest destiny worth the cost for human lives? Do you think that the creation of America as it is worth the commodification of all these lives? No, I don't think it's worth it. I don't think this iPhone is worth it. I don't think this YouTube channel is worth it. I don't think any of it is worth it. I would prefer if they did not do that. Thank you. And apparently the opposition's opinions matter more. And I'm sure you can understand why. Because they're the ones that are written in the textbooks and the reason why we're still having this conversation. Today, it's okay, you say, but 50 years from now, we might say it's so wrong when we're talking about owning a pet. And he was referencing slavery. Today, yeah, it's okay to own a pet. Humanity has always owned pets. To be honest, the above is a link of a timeline of humanity's history with pets as a symbiotic relationship. So we see enslavement is different than owning a pet. The pet owner relationship is completely different than the slave and slave owner relationship. Without going into the obvious science of different species, mankind uses animals like dogs or cats, hamsters, lizards, fish, etc. to gain something like companionship. In the past, we did this because we needed protection or a quick source of meat when we were on the go. This is why we kept dogs, cattle, all sorts of fun pets on the road with us. This can also be thought as, well, you are keeping the wolf just to eat it and to protect you. So that could be seen as selfish. In reality, the science says that the animals, especially animals like canines and felines, and now we're learning that lizards react in similar ways to stimuli like this, they actually like living like this. They live longer lives because they're protected and we are a source of protection for them. They're a source of protection for us. They get the same sort of weird companionship chip in their brain when they're with us, just like we get with them. That's something that the slave and the slave owner dynamic doesn't have. Doesn't have that sort of companionship or psychological well-being. They've evolved alongside us, animals, and have a bond that expands throughout most of human history. We've had dogs, cats, rats, all sorts of things for a long time. And we've bred them to react to stimuli that is favorable to us. Like, we're able to make drug dogs, we're able to make cancer dogs, we're able to create animals to react to our own sensibilities. And that's a lot different than maybe just stealing a guy and hiding him in your basement and making him sew your dresses. That's different. That's very different. The wolf could have easily turned on the hunter and gone on his way, but he recognizes that he needs to help and serve. It's a biological need in the back of the mind of a lot of animals. We don't, need a fence to keep a sled dog around. But you will need a fence to keep a cow around because they will just graze and graze if you keep the fence unlocked. But your sled dog, who understands the loyalty and understands the validity of his need for you, will stay loyal to you for the rest of your life. You cannot apply that same dynamic to a enslaved human because there's a completely different psychological manipulation going on there. There has to be power dynamics. There has to be fear-based. Humans don't just obey each other for no good reason, especially under duress or under breeding to do so. Oh, I feel like a broken record just saying the same thing over and over again. I assume dog is what you're referring to when you compared to how slave owners get about their slaves and vice versa. It would be less like this and more like how one sees cattle. much less like how one sees a dog companion and much more like one sees cattle. So cattle is an ends to a mean and not an individual being in need of attention and care and love, etc. Sure, you will feed it, and one time you might put it in the barn if it's raining, and you might put out the barn if it's on fire. But it really doesn't matter if this one dies individually. I can just buy another one with the money that the rest of the parts of it can give me. It's a commodity, not a companionship. I mean, sure, there are the good ones that like their cows individually and treat them as individual lives, but that's not the purpose of livestock and cattle. And that's the purpose of the Atlantic slave trade, was not to keep a nice human as a pet in your house and to treat him like an equal. If you treated him like an equal, he might ask to vote. He might ask for a job. He might ask to marry your daughter. Oh no, he might ask to even be referred to as a human being. We don't want that. We want to reduce them to cattle and to disenfranchise them and make them as the other. And that is what Jim Crow was. That's why slavery is so fucking terrible. It's not like some, blip in our society that we just got over. No, it's a horrible scar in America's foundation. And we can't just forget about that, and especially as Canadians, just disingenuously dismiss it as something that was normal back then. Definitely not normal. I mean, you can keep chickens and care for them. Hell, I can even love them. But at the end of the day, I still have to choose one and eat it. It's easier not to name the one that you're probably going to choose and eat, or to have it away from the rest, or maybe to just treat it a little bit differently, or you just let him live, and you never let him see it coming. Either way, that chicken isn't like my dog or my cat. I need him to do one thing, and one thing only. That's be alive and then die for me. Some do view that as wrong, because those people are vegan or vegetarian, and for the most part, those people are correct, because you can't just, keep another being and eat and just for the purpose of killing it. But that's what livestock is, and that's not what we have pets for. We don't keep our fish just in case we get hungry one day, but that's why you keep an animal on a farm, and that's why they kept slaves. I'm sorry, commenter, that's in your idealistic world. Sure, maybe they'd save up so badly so they could have their family slaves, so they could treat them just like one of their own. No, it's not adoption, you dumb shit. God. Because those people, the people that are oh so nice to their animals, they're correct, they're vegan. Comparing humans to animals in your analogy, even if you recognize it as a poor example, use it anyway. Humans have never been animals. We've never been animals. Another man has never been seen as an animal to each other. And we have never seen each other culturally as animals. This has only been used as a means to control society into being okay with enslaving each other or reducing each other, acting violent to one another. The same reasoning that tells me it's okay to kill a pig and not a dog. Sure, that in 50 years, we might be at a place where taking any life for any reason is wrong because there's no benefit to it. I'm not going to have a conversation about how there might or may not be a benefit to killing animals, to eating them, because I am a meat eater. I also recognize the validity behind the statement of killing being wrong. Yeah. But when we're talking about people and keeping people under any circumstances is always going to be wrong, even if it's genuinely accepted as okay. I'm a meat eater, and it's genuinely accepted to be okay. But in 50 years from now, it might not be considered as okay, and we'll look back at every single person that was like, why did you do that? You had the choice not to do that. And you're 100% right. I have the choice not to do that. And I will take that L when it comes. That's okay. It's like saying the god-awful country, the US, is totally worth all the pain and suffering that was used to create it. It's not worth it because we're still fighting the exact same things in the exact same ways The fragile economic system that was built on slavery is still present. Are you a bad person today for owning a pet, you say? If you abuse that pet and use it as a form of economic labor, yeah, I would say that you're a bad pet owner. I'd say you're a bad person too. That's why a lot of people are vegan. That's why a lot of people don't have show pets. That's why a lot of people spay and neuter their pets. Sure, there are a lot of obvious cruelty measures when it comes to keeping another animal. It is not the same thing as enslaving another person. You are making such a disingenuous argument that it's making my brain bleed, so please see the above passage for the answer to today's pressing question, because we already discussed it's very different. So he says, I get that these are humans we're talking about, but their perspective needs to come from time. You don't seem to grasp that we are talking about humans here. You don't seem to understand it. If you did, the first example to combat your point would be not comparing slavery to having a pet or cattle or animal exploitation of labor. If you understood that it was wrong, you still made the point, and you still press send. You still press send. So, having cattle or any sort of animal exploitation would probably be a more accurate comparison than owning a pet. You made the exact example as if a slave would be as valuable to the owner as a family dog, or that, oh God, that would rarely be the case. Because historically, a lot of people who own dogs treat them well and say owning endangered species of dogs, if that exists, and not taking care of them properly, or maybe taking them from their natural environment, that would be objectively morally wrong. And I'd argue also would owning a human being in any parameter. If the only barrier between what is classified as you as a human or an animal was the skin color you had and the fact that you were forcibly brought here, I'm pretty sure that you'd be pretty upset. And you'd probably be really upset that people to this day would try to justify your experience and your ancestors' experience as something that was just widely accepted and normal, and we shouldn't actively talk about how terrible it was. Their perspective that violently keeping and using other humans for labor did need to come with time. Sure, yeah, it needed to come with time. Forces outside of general Americans had to use decades of propaganda to instill the idea that Black Americans needed to be suppressed or enslaved for their well-being. It's not a natural idea that occurs in society and needs to be routinely handled every time we're on our way in and out of a room. Every instance of human slavery has been opposed and subsequently abolished. It happens. Sure, you could say slavery and enslaving each other and human cruelty is part of our nature, but just as much you could argue freedom and liberty and, pursuit of happiness and all those things are also a part of human nature, to the point where they will always be at some point of contention with oppressing forces. Because those who contributed to slavery and enabled it were wrong. Keyword is man-made. It's man-made slavery. It's not something that came across naturally. It was just the way that human beings act. It was something that was deliberate, created, and toxic from its inception, particularly from the people enslaved. They definitely opposed it, and many sympathetic individuals throughout history also opposed it as well. So we have the final few passages here of what this guy had to say. He says, correct. Today, it's bad if you have slaves. Okay. Let's break this down piece by piece. Centrist types and like alt-right wingers, just like disingenuous bad actor politicians, rely on statements like this or like your statement to tire us out and cause us to break down and not want to talk about every individual point in a sentence because it's hard and it's time consuming. You want me to focus on the idea of owning a pet and the fact that it's okay now but may not be okay later, and not the idea that human beings have not been treated equally. And I'm not really sure what to say in regards to that. History is fluid and changes based on who's telling it and what is being said, how it's being said, and what information and medium it's coming from. You have this idea that possibly not every slave owner was bad. And you would be right there, of course, but people who recognized that this was a system that they had to live within and gave their family, what they could, these reductionist issues. I think I might be rereading a passage. Okay, never mind. I wasn't rereading a passage. That was just the conclusion, so it sounded familiar. So history is not fluid. Sorry. History is completely fluid, and it changes based on who's telling it, what is being said, how it's being said, and even the information medium that it's coming from. You, the commenter, the person that gave me all of this content, have this idea that possibly not every slave owner was bad. And you would be right there, I guess, of course, if you want to reduce it to such a simple concept. But if we're going to expand it to the obvious point, is that no, all of them were fundamentally bad because of them upholding the system, regardless of the popularity of the system. I'm not going to play the blame game, but I'm going to say that it's definitely their fault that this was a system that continued to grow and continued to prosper, even if they found themselves one of the good ones. So, after all of this, the American people required so much propaganda to manipulate them into relating with upper class, middle-aged white men more than the oppressed minorities who live similar lives to them and live in similar conditions to them. They're more likely to relate to them based on optics and based on struggle, but no, there had to be this constant bombardment of purity complex and Christianity and the American dream. Every single person had to fit within this cookie cutter establishment idea of what a good Republican is, what a good Democrat is, what a good American is. And if you didn't fall in line with that, then you were one of the others, one of the problem, the bad guy. So you're contributing to that horrible, horrible perpetuation of misunderstandings and misinformation when it comes to slavery and the perception of slavery at the time. And it doesn't take 50 years for me to tell you that you might be a bad person for taking the time to ask me this question instead of researching the actual effects of slavery in modern times on your own. I will know if everyone gets the chance to read the whole passage or at least watch the whole video, because a lot of the comments in here are probably going to be like weirdly like anti Black Lives Matter, anti this, anti that. It just seems very silly. If you like videos like this, continue to watch them. It's a little tiresome to continue to talk for this long, but I just wanted to get this video out there, edit it, put some work out into the world. I do think the person that sent me this message that I decided to debunk and spend all this time on isn't a bad person. I just think that the way that it was worded was obviously misinformed. But if you like videos like this, continue to watch them. This has been Politerotica with the Politerotica Report, signing out. Back to you in the studio.